Hi folks! Before you get into this episode, go back and listen to the two-part episode on the Glenanne Gang, which was released earlier this season, as there will be a bit of crossover. In this episode, I sat down with Joe Campbell, whose father, Joe Campbell Senior, was a Catholic man who joined the RUC and was subsequently murdered by loyalists. It's a killing where the unmistakable question of collusion still lingers in the air today. Joe has devoted decades of his life to finding out exactly who killed his father and trying to bring those who knew about the killing to justice. This is his story. This is the Troubles Podcast, a podcast about the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and Great Britain, as multiple sides and organisations waged a bloody conflict over the status of Northern Ireland. If you drive north of the city of Belfast, you enter into what is known as the Glens of Antrim. It's an extremely scenic part of Northern Ireland, where these beautiful hilly regions push up against the Irish coastline. Cushendall is a small coastal village which can be found along the way. For most of the Troubles, it was seen as somewhat immune to the violence which had been taking place elsewhere. And it's where Joe Campbell Senior was killed in 1977. I sat down with Joe Campbell Junior and asked him to tell me a little bit about his father. Just a heads up that the audio quality for this interview was originally quite poor. I managed to recover most of it in editing, but some of the words may sound a bit jumbled, and you'll also hear me chiming in throughout this chat. So let's get into it.
My dad and his two brothers and sister lived in Scottstown in County Monaghan. My grandfather was a guard, he served in Garda Síochána in Scottstown, and he was there for that's where he brought up his family. Originally Donegal direction. My grandmother, father, I think south, probably Armagh, but moved from Rathmullen. I think my dad was born in it. Well, I know my dad was born in Rathmullen, but the family moved to Scottstown where my granda was stationed, and that's where they lived, and that's where my granda and my grandmother lived out there years. And, brought up not normal household, again, GA family. My dad and my uncle son, we both played Gaelic football. Don't think my dad was much use at it. He was more a soccer man. My uncle Sonny played with. And I think for no other reason than a steady job, my dad and his brother cycled into Monaghan one particular day to join cards.
One more time, sorry, to do what? To
join the guards.
Join the guards, okay, sorry,
yeah. And there was an embargo on recruitment at that time. So they cycled back out to Scottstown. They had, I don't know what was defined as lunch in those days. There was no such thing as lunch, but they had something to eat. And they went out to Enniskillen, and they joined the RUC. There was no political ideology about it. And I understand today in the context of what happened in the north and the south of Ireland during what is known as the Troubles. How people view that, how a Catholic could join, but there was no other reasons than making money.
Would this have been about the mid-60s or so, or what?
No, 50s.
Okay. So at the time, the RUC was, what, 80%, 90% Protestant, maybe?
Absolutely. It was a Protestant, it was a Protestant police force for Protestant people in those days. That's what it was. And that's not meant to, in this context, as a criticism. That's what it was. That was a fact. But, so they joined, and my dad trained in Derry. In the depot in Derry. He met my mum there. They got married. When he passed out, they were stationed in originally Moneymore, which was in County Derry. They got moved from there to Crossmaglen. They were in Crossmaglen in the late 50s when the border campaign was going on. I mean, I was obviously very, very young then, but as I understand, that border campaign really didn't amount to much and it fizzled out.
Yeah, it was kind of...
Not significant in terms of what happened in the, in the years afterwards. But, I mean, Crossmaglen's a predominantly nationalist, Republican, area. And interesting, when my dad left, the local councillor, it was an independent nationalist councillor, pulled together a petition and my dad kept there. And there were over 2,000 people who signed the petition.
So they wanted him back?
No, they wanted him to stay. Yeah, they didn't want him to go.
Wow, okay. So, well, it makes sense, I guess. Probably, if you imagine like a population, at least seeing kind of someone they can kind of, that isn't considered, I guess, the other in a way, in that position of power, I'd say would be, someone representing them and their needs and their concerns,
I think it was even more than that, Ocean. He was seen as a fair, honest, decent man with no political allegiance to swing, and that panned out later when we moved to Cushendall, in the place that we all call home now. My father was always, he was years before his time. He was like your village Bobby. He wasn't caught up in the pot. He understood the nature of policing in those days. But in terms of the job that he did, he was your village policeman. He was fair, decent, open, honest. A village Bobby in Cushendall, but he was conscious. He was conscious of the threat of violence, and he wanted to keep violence away from the Glens of Antrim, in the area that he worked in.
And the nature of this job, like, would he get relocated every 5 years, kind of, and you as a family then would just go with him, or how does it work?
That's what happened in the early days, and he was offered a couple of promotions, but you know what, Ocean, when he arrived in Cushendall, that was always going to be home. So the oldest in the family then would have been, I suppose, Tommy was, he was 19, 20 when my dad was killed. My father was only 47 when he was murdered. My mother was 41 years of age, and there were 8 in the family. The oldest was 19. The youngest was 4.
So when you moved to Cushendall, then was this 5 years, 10 years before he was killed, or?
Yeah, no, it was about I think it was about 10, 12 years. But so my dad was well known and well liked in Cushendall, in the Glens of Antrim, and thankfully the trouble was largely past the Glens by.
So do you kind of remember the start of, I guess, tension, I guess is the way to say it,
Well, there was always tension. You were conscious. I mean, we were conscious that there was a lot of tension. And lots of my friends were from Belfast. Because areas like the Glens, the coastal nationalist areas, would have attracted people who were coming from Belfast, during trouble hotspots.
Would you have had, did it matter what nationality the friends you had, or was it very distinctive?
Well, it is a fact that that Cushendall is almost 99%, nationalist. I had very little opportunity to mix with people from the Unionist community.
I then asked Joe if he was ever worried about his father working as an RUC officer, at a time when Republicans targeted many Catholics working in roles which were seen to aid the Unionist government.
So I have to say, were we concerned at the time? No, but we should have been concerned, but for different reasons. I think it would be safe to say that we were never concerned about a threat from Republicans towards my father.
Okay, interesting, because I think the Republicans in other parts of Northern Ireland, they would have threatened Catholic officers.
They would, but that shows you the particular. the particular circumstances that we encountered. So just to explain about that a bit more. So my father was accepted. We live probably 150 yards from the police station. My dad was part of the local community. He would have had a drink in the local hotel, which was about 200 yards from the house. He would have mixed. He would have been out and about. He wouldn't have had UDR patrols in the area. He could have instead. He wouldn't have had army patrols anywhere near, because as I said earlier, the Troubles largely passed us by, and he was instrumental in that. We were no different than any other teenagers growing up. We were all lively. We all did lots. We were all out and up to mischief. But thankfully, for the majority of the people that I grew up, they largely, managed to avoid being involved in the conflict.
Okay, so you wouldn't have had any friends who got into paramilitary activity or anything like that, or?
I do know people. I do know people through associations who did get involved, but largely in Cushendall, no, and the surrounding areas.
When I asked Joe about how his father's fellow constables perceived him, he explained.
There was certainly resentment within the RUC about my father's approach to police.
Because they thought he might be biased towards the nationalist population or something?
Yes. Yeah, so it was easy, to label him as a nationalist and nothing could be further from the truth, because we weren't a political family, Ocean. But even us growing up, we weren't political. We were very conscious of of the issues across the island. But we just weren't political people. Neither was my dad. My dad wasn't a political person, but he was very conscious about protecting the community, all of the community.
Joe Senior was in a very precarious position. He was a Catholic in an overwhelmingly Protestant police force, and though he had the respect of his community, this also put a target on his back.
One of the ironic things about all of this for us is that I understand that, there would be some Republicans who look at my dad as a traitor because he was in the RUC. I get that. I don't agree with it. You have to see beyond the uniform to see what he was trying to do. Also get that there were people in the unionist community and people in the police, and many of them, who looked at my dad as just another fiend bastard. So we had, both, but we were all smart enough and level-headed enough to not try and let that impact our lives. It did impact in some ways. We were able to cope with that. So my dad was always on a loser. But the ironic thing was that if you look into in the context of the day, my dad was an Irish citizen in the RUC, Catholic, at a very difficult time, and was making a difference. And that would go some way to understanding the motivation to murder him.
This brings us to the day of Joe Senior's killing. In the past, the Cushendall police station would have had around 13 RUC officers living there. But by 1977, the station was staffed by just 3 people. Seamus Hamill, Pat Donaghy and Joe Campbell Senior. It would appear that it was rare that the men would wear their guns. Joe described them as bobby police officers, who didn't feel the need to wear their guns while walking around the village, as there simply wasn't a threat.
So what had happened was the previous week, myself and my brother, Peter, God rest him, got involved in a skirmish at the local dance hall on the Sunday night. And I was in the police station the week after on the Friday, on the night my dad was killed. My dad was at the house. I was in the police station making a statement about that, because after the skirmish in the dance hall, there was a few lads followed us up to the house. My dad was out. He was in the hotel having a beer with my mum. And they broke the windows in the house.
Oh, okay, you got into a fight with a couple of guys, probably with drink.
Yeah. My fault, no doubt about that. Put my hand up. That's what happened when you were a teenager.
Yeah, of course.
It wasn't political, and neither was the attack on the house. A little strange, but and those guys had absolutely nothing to do with my father's murder.
Yeah, it was just.
Yeah, it was just teenage activity.
Foolish youth.
But absolutely.
Yeah.
So I was down in the house. I was down at the station. My dad obviously couldn't. He was off duty that night, but I was in the station making a statement about that attack. So, my dad, there was a two-way telephone system between the house and the police station, the barracks, we called it. And there was a phone call to the house my father took. And just to say, my father had only just been back to work. He'd had a stroke, and he was just getting back, and he was a bit lame on his left-hand side, but he was, getting back to work again. But he put on his gun. So we believe that he was told they were coming for him.
So he got a phone call at the house, and you've no idea who or what the call was, but then he put on his gun and he left.
Yeah, we have an idea who the call was. We believe it was an agent who was working with McCormick, Tony O'Doherty. He had a Republican background, but he was trained by the SAS 74. He worked in, his brother was quite senior in the INLA.
Why would he give the call then, to try and give your dad a heads up?
No. It was telling they were coming. Because you see, my father didn't have a friend in the RUC at that time. There was nobody he could call on who was going to come to his assistance. So he was the loneliest man in the world at that point. He knew they were coming. And I believe he came to the station because he knew I was still there. And he wore his gun. And so he knew the threat. And he didn't want them coming to the house either.
Yeah, because he knew they'd come to wherever he was, and he didn't want to put his family at risk.
Oh, the family were there. It could have been another Reeby or O'Dowd, or it would have no compunction whatsoever in killing all of us. They wouldn't have cared. So I think he felt, he was concerned for my safety, and he wanted to come away from the house. But I think he knew he probably wasn't going back to the house that night. So he came to the station. I was leaving. I was just finishing off my statement. We can hear the gates open. Seamus Hamill was taking my statement. And as I got out, my dad came out of a side office, and he walked me out to the gate, and he said, "Go up home quickly." I didn't think anything of it because I was only 19 at the time. What does that mean? So I went up to the house. I saw a couple of my mates who were walking along the road. I just passed my driving test and saw a couple of them. I knew they were going out to Waterfoot, which is a mile and a half away, for beer. I wasn't going that night, so I asked them, did they want a lift? So I got the car up. My mum drove the two lads out, and when I come back, which was only about 7 or 8 minutes, I could see my mum outside that something happened to her father. And I ran down to the station, and he was lying on the ground outside, and there was none there. The local GP was there, and a couple of other people, and it was clear he was very seriously injured. He was shot in the back of the head.
Joe Senior was lifted up onto the desk of the police station. The ambulance then arrived, and he was loaded into the back of the ambulance alongside his son and the doctor. He then passed away in the ambulance on the way to the hospital.
The ambulance arrived. They took him. I went in the ambulance with him, along with the local GP, and he died on the way to the hospital. So,
we will get into the official investigation later, but for now, I asked Joe why he believed his father was targeted.
But one of the key things that my father discovered was, and we believe this was the central reason for him being murdered, that just in the next village, which is about a mile and a half away from us, Waterfoot, there's a little pier there called Red Bay Pier. And my father discovered that there was guns, arms being smuggled in by elements within security forces and loyalist paramilitaries.
So, did your father discover, say, the likes that the elements of the security forces were essentially smuggling guns for loyalists?
With
them. Okay.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay, so and how do you discover that? Just in the nature of his job, in the nature of...
Well, I mean, lots of local people knew him. It was a small harm where, everywhere, you know what it's like in small communities. But it's important to say as well that for all those incidents that we talked about, say, those shootings and bombings, it's absolutely confirmed. In fact, there were some within special branch in our local, I wouldn't say local, Palomina was kind of our headquarters then, if you like, in terms of a reporting structure. Now you see, the outlying villages, most of them had police stations. The police station is gone in Cushendall now. There was one in Glenravel, it's gone. There was one in Glenarm, it's gone. But there were 3, perhaps 4 officers there who were putting in official intelligence document with concerns for some of the activities that were going on in the Glens of Antrim. They were called SB50s. There were threats to my father's life, not from Republicans, but from within the RUC. And I have first-hand testimony of officers one of the officers who was putting in the intelligence reports. I've spoken to him on a number of occasions. He actually went to the assistant chief constable, with concerns about the threat to my father's life. They talked about the intelligence reports. And that person said the boss is dealing with it. And the boss at that time was Kenneth Newman.
So the chief constable of the RUC was Kenneth Newman, is that correct?
Kenneth Newman is his name, yeah. And I have said on a number of occasions publicly when I'm talking about this, that Kenneth Newman was a dishonourable man and did not do anything about that. But it turns out that he didn't know. He wasn't aware of these intelligence reports. Something happened there, that were those intelligence reports going. But the assistant chief constable, I could name him. He said that they were being dealt with, that the boss had it in hand, but something happened. So my father, we believe that my father had pushed this up the line about the importation of the arms, and decision was made that he had to go.
So a serving RUC officer is killed. What sort of investigation took place?
The RUC case against him, when eventually there was a trial, there was 2 investigations. The first one, there was about 3 or 4 sheets of paper in a folder. So there were no basic, all the things that you see in TV that you think are, houses there, but did anybody see anything, what was going on in the village? Were there any roadblocks out that night? Any eyewitnesses? None of that. Even the second time around, a lot of that. And the officer who was in charge in the second time around, when I sent a journalist to visit him, said, actually, those people down there wouldn't have cooperated with us. Those people down there.
Eventually, one man was arrested on suspicion of carrying out the killing, Sergeant Charlie McCormack. McCormack was the handler of Republican informant Tony O'Doherty, but the two began an unusual partnership, which saw them carrying out crimes together. O'Doherty had been recruited by McCormack in 1971, and from 1974 onwards, the two carried out a number of bank robberies to line their pockets. According to one source that I came across, McCormack killed Joe Senior because he had become suspicious of the pair's activities together. Joe Junior would not agree with this take. Eventually, Tony was arrested on an unrelated charge in 1980, and it was under interrogation he claimed that McCormack had killed Joe Campbell. McCormack went to trial, with the only evidence being that of Tony the informer. McCormack was found guilty on charges related to robbery, but in the case of killing Joe Senior, he was acquitted, with the judge saying, quote, "My firm conclusion is that it would be highly dangerous to convict the accused on any of the charges against him unless the evidence is supported by clear and compelling corroboration." There have also been reports that MI5 bugged McCormack's home and have tape recording evidence in which he admits to the killing. This claim comes from a senior security source and was published in some news outlets online, but the tape recording has not ever been made public and was not used in the trial. Here's Joe Jr. talking about the court case.
So their case was that it was McCormack and McCormack alone. So he drove to Cushendall with O'Doherty. On a February night, winter time, he put a rifle over his shoulder. He ran down a laneway. There's a laneway. There's a little mountain outside our place called Lurrigaden. That he parked the car there. They ran down a laneway that a tractor could barely go up. It's rocky. It's overgrown. He went down, and that's about 100 yards from the police station. And he's supposed to have walked down that road with a rifle over his shoulder. A rifle at night time. Shot his father. Then went back up that laneway to get in my car and go off. I mean, it's in my view, it's fantasy stuff.
Apologies for the bad audio there. Joe believes that this telling of the killing is fantasy stuff. It's simply not possible. There was a second trial, which had a little bit more steam in it than the first one, but it still failed to convict anyone. Then, an ombudsman report was released in 2004, and according to Joe, the ombudsman investigators had difficulty gathering data regarding interviewing people for the case.
One of the ironic things about the ombudsman's report, although it wasn't able to say who committed the murder and why it was committed, what it did say was a number of key RUC personnel refused to cooperate with the inquiry. We're talking up to assistant chief constable level now. One of them who was living in London, I think he still lives in London. The ombudsman's investigators knocked on his door, and he wasn't very complimentary to them. They then got a solicitor's letter from him. They went back again. The second time when they opened the door and they told them that they were investigating the murder of Sergeant Campbell, he told them to fuck off. The retired RUC Officers Association took out a legal challenge against the ombudsman. So what it also did say was the number of statements, files and reports that had been lost. So the whole thing, points to a conspiracy where they knew in advance that my father was going to be murdered. It was probably authorised at a senior level within the RUC. For me, the McCormack trial was a farce.
So who does Joe think carried out the killing of his father? To answer this, we need to return to the Glenanne Gang. For those unaware, this was a group made up of loyalist paramilitaries, and specifically members of the Mid-Ulster Brigade of the paramilitary group, the UVF. But what made the Glenanne Gang different is that they were also made up of members of the British Army's Ulster Defence Regiment and the Northern Irish Police Force, the RUC. These were members who wore uniforms by day and plotted bombings and killings by night. 6 weeks after Joe Campbell Senior was killed, chemist William Strathern was killed. I touched on this killing earlier this season, but Joe added more context as to why Strathern was targeted. According to Joe, a reserve RUC constable had been shot in the area by Republicans. William McCaughey was a Glenanne Gang member and also a member of the RUC. And he decided that revenge would need to be exacted upon the nationalist population. McCaughey then approached Glenanne Gang member Robin Jackson. Jackson, who was also known as the Jackal, was a notorious loyalist gunman who has been connected to scores of killings during the Troubles. William Strathern was a Catholic chemist who had a distinctive scar on his face. McCaughey told Jackson that the scar was as a result of making bombs for the Provisional IRA, which was a lie. Strathern was never involved in any paramilitary activity whatsoever. So at 2 a.m. at night, 2 men knocked on the door of Strathern's home, which was also the village's main shop and chemist, saying that they needed to get medication for a sick child. When Strathern opened the door, he was shot dead. Joe believes that this killing and that of his father were carried out by the same people in the Glenanne Gang.
I've been told by people in the know that, one was a carbon copy of the other.
In total, 4 gang members were believed to have taken part in the killing of Strathern. Robin Jackson, William McCaughey, a man by the name of Robert John Kerr, and John Weir. John Weir is the man whose affidavit revealed a lot about the goings-on within the Glenanne Gang and how they operated. Both Weir and McCaughey were paramilitaries, but also RUC officers. Weir was eventually arrested for this killing in 1979, and he confessed that he took part. Weir and McCaughey were at the scene of the Strathern shooting, but claimed that they remained in the getaway car. But though he named Robin Jackson and Robert John Keir as taking part in the killing of Strathern, neither of the men were charged by reasons of operational strategy. This is an unusual thing for the security services to say when they have one of the attackers naming 2 other people involved in the killing. Joe and his family believe that the killing was carried out by Robin Jackson, who was aided by rogue elements of the RUC.
There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that it was Robin Jackson who did it. And no doubt in my mind whatsoever from all my investigations that Jackson was responsible for it. And you see, the modus operandi where Jackson got away, he got away with everything, Ocean.
We're not quite at the end of this episode, but let's look back and see where we are now. We have Joe Campbell Senior killed, and his son, Joe Campbell Junior, believes that this killing was authorised by the security services in Northern Ireland, so those in leadership positions in the RUC. There were 2 trials in 1977 and 1980 with no convictions, and then an ombudsman report which came out in 2014. The ombudsman's report ruled that the killing of Joe was preventable. Quote, "Senior RUC officers and management had information on a very specific threat and failed to respond. There was no corrective action taken by the RUC to warn Joe Campbell, increase patrols, or move him from his position. None of that happened." Knowing the names of the people that he believed killed his father, he decided to try something unusual: to knock on their door and ask them if they did it. He started with the man who went to trial accused of killing Joe Senior, Sergeant Charlie McCormick. They then doorstepped William McCaughey.
Oh yeah, well, they let us in. They all let us in. Like McCormick brought us in. Although, and he got the Bible out and swore that he had nothing to do with it. But as we were leaving, it sort of ended a bit abruptly. It's fair to say. But as we were leaving, he said this to us. He said, "Now, boys, I'll help you any way I can. But the next time you come to visit me, be sure and tell me in advance so that I can make sure nothing happens to you on the way here."
In 1998, Joe then made the decision to come face to face with the man he believed who killed his father, Robin the Jackal Jackson. Martin O'Hagan was an investigative journalist who was working with Joe, and when he found Robin Jackson's address, he asked Joe if he'd like to try knocking on his door. Joe was living in London by this stage.
Martin said to me, Martin said to me, he said, if I can find him, will you call? I said, sure. Well, he phoned me one. I was working with British Telecom at the time. Martin phoned me on a Thursday evening. He says, I found him. He said, he's not well. It was here he died. I says, yep. So, never forget, I paid £500 return. I flew over, Martin picked me up at Belfast International. We drove down, we had a wee bit of breakfast at the Boyle Roundabout, and he took me up to Donaghcloney, which is where Jackson lived. And I got in all right. Getting out wasn't as easy. The inside of his door, it was an ordinary council house, but steel-plated door with 3 bolt locks on it. So he discovered that I was taping it.
You had a tape in your pocket or something, did you?
A wire going out the lapel of my down the back of my trousers, and Martin was taping it all in the car outside. However, one of Martin's, God rest Martin was my good mate, but one of his cameos, he didn't tell me he was going to do this. I was sitting with my back to the window. Jackson was sitting with his back to the wall. Martin took a photograph of him over my shoulder in the window. Because there are very few photographs of him that exist. If you go looking, there aren't any.
Okay.
So anyway, what happened was, those are the days where you had the processing room for the photographs. Wasn't digital, I don't think, at that stage. So the photograph went missing in the reproduction room in the Sunday World offices.
So how did the conversation go? I know you say he was very sick. Was he sound of mind? Was he?
Yeah, he was sound of mind. Oh, yeah. I think his words to me were, when I put it to him, I'm convinced I had nothing to do with that murder.
Joe was wearing a wire in the hopes to get Jackson to admit to the murder of his father. But when the wire was discovered, the men were told to leave. Robin Jackson died of lung cancer later that year, on the 30th of May 1998. Though it's generally considered that he was linked to around 50 killings during the Troubles, Jackson never faced any charges. O'Hagan was later gunned down by Billy Wright's LVF. Joe mentioned that there are those who say to him, it's been 33 years, why doesn't he put this killing behind him and move on? But he doesn't think it's as easy as that.
I often get asked, why can't you put that all behind you? You know?
It's your dad.
Yeah, he existed. He was a good man. He had all the right attributes, and and lived the values in his community to try and make it a better society. And that's why he was murdered.
I think we're going to leave it there for now. This interview was recorded in 2023 and released in December 2024. And if there are any new developments, I'll be sure to update the episode. This interview was fairly massive, and we went on a number of different tangents. If you want to listen to the entire interview, I'll have it available over on patreon.com/The Troubles Podcast. Finally, I'd like to say thanks again to Joe Junior for coming on to tell us the story of his dad. That's it from me. Thanks, and see you next time.